Welcome to NeuroNoodle's Neurofeedback and Neuropsychology Podcast, featuring tech legend Jake Gunkelman. He's the man who has read well over 500,000 brain scans, and Dr. Mari Swingle, author of iMinds. Our goal is to provide information and promote options for better mental health. The NeuroNoodle Podcast is supported by listeners and businesses just like you. Jake Gunkelman.
Good morning.
What tickles your ivories this morning?
Well, we've seen changes in adolescents and their psychiatric presentation. The fact that they get 2 hours less sleep per night. There's some major things going on, and they basically need to be addressed at a neurophysiological level, not a pharmacological level, because all the drugs that you take to counter anxiety virtually are addictive. Sedating drugs, benzodiazepines, GABA B drugs like Flexeril. I mean, there's a lot of meds out there that can be taken for anxiety, and very few of them end up being good long term. But the complaint of anxiety can be addressed neurophysiologically. And to start with, it's not just a head. We're not a disembodied brain. And the body has electrical activity going on as well. The sympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system controls your eccrine sweat glands, the sweat glands on your hands and face and feet.
Right.
Not like temperature for perspiration, but these are emotional perspiration. There's actually a small muscle in the sweat gland that acts like a syringe, and it's a myoepithelial cell, sympathetically innervated. It can squirt out when triggered with something, a sympathetic arousal. Mm-hmm. So your electrodermal activity, what used to be called galvanic skin response, the old GSR lie detector kind of stuff, but that's a measurement of peripheral arousal. You also have temperature, and some people that are anxious end up having cold hands, and that's also sympathetically innervated. Hello, Mari.
Hello.
Dr. Mari.
Hello.
So we were just chatting about the dire circumstance of some of the younger adolescents complaining of anxiety. I was just saying it's not all, anxiety isn't all in your head, and the peripheral measurement, peripheral to who, it's the same person, but the electrodermal activity, and I described the eccrine sweat glands and sympathetic innervation, and temperature also sympathetically innervated. So cold hands and the obvious cold wet hand, which is an obvious indication of a gross sympathetic overarousal. And it's everybody's shaking hands with somebody who's got a cold wet hand, and that's an indication of a really very, very, very overaroused individual. So
piggyback that day, I would just 100% with you. It's not where it is, it's where you're measuring it. It's every body and the brain.
Yeah. So in the brain, we actually end up having a few things that can end up looking like anxiety. Anxiety is like a DSM category, and it's not a homogeneous thing. And the fact that you have anxiety doesn't predict a specific treatment. What you need to do is look to see what kind of anxiety they have by looking at the brain and the body. And if you see electrodermal and temperature, you've got some peripheral training that can be done very readily with biofeedback devices to end up putting sympathetic nervous system under your volitional control and winding down that over-arousal. Very easily done, and very inexpensive devices. But, the brain can also be a part of this. And anxiety quite often ends up leading to addiction. And that's an unfortunate circumstance, but it's an extremely common drive. Anxiety either has gross over-arousal, and 2/3 of the addicted people have over-arousal as their drive, or they may have an anterior cingulate disturbance, which drives their anxiety. And that also can give a drive towards addiction, an obsessive compulsive drive. 1/3 of the addicted population have an anterior cingulate problem. The over-arousal people can end up with alpha theta style training. And that's about 2/3 of the population that's got addiction. The other 1/3 have to have the anterior cingulate dealt with. And that's not posterior alpha theta that does it. You got to get up front and fix the cingulate. The cingulate has 3 primary failure modes. It can fail in slow or alpha. Those are the 2 that were identified by Leslie Pritchett and Roy John in their initial cluster analysis of OCD. There's one kind of OCD in the DSM. Yeah. So why not just look for 2 kinds with a cluster analysis? And it found a slow cluster that responded 15% of the time to an SSRI, which is commonly what's given for OCD. Luvox is kind of the knee-jerk SSRI to give, but others are used as well. But if you have a slow pattern, 15%, well, you get a 30 to 35% response to placebo. So 15% is essentially a non-responding cluster. The alpha cluster, on the other hand, had an 85% positive response to SSRI. Where else? Point anywhere else in the literature where there's an 85% success rate for an SSRI. Give me a break. This is a lock and key. This pattern is an SSRI, flag. If you've got anterior cingulate, high coherence up front, you've got an SSRI. If it's above 10, then unfortunately you're too, too over-aroused. The SSRI will end up causing a problem at that point, but a tetracyclic at that point can work. So, there's the brain can be involved in it, and the solution is in typically at that point in neurofeedback more than pharmacological. The anterior cingulate had 2 clusters found by their cluster analysis. We've also seen an anterior cingulate beta cluster. Roy John used a database that only went up to 25 hertz, and we quite often see beta spindles in the high 20s, low 30s. So, they weren't available in their data set. So, but if you disturb the cingulate's function with alpha or theta or beta, what you get is a dysfunctional cingulate giving you either a locked on, like OCD, or a locked off, amotivation, lack of initiation, anhedonia. So, we can't tell when we look at it whether it's on or off. We could just say, well, that's not what, it's not working. And we can design an intervention to fix that. And, it's not an easy spot to get at. It's deep, but it projects, the EEG projects up to the surface there well enough. We can get at it from a surface electrode. There's some people that design a Loretta source localization to actually describe the anterior cingulate that they're going to be training, and they train it with the S Loretta, not a Z-score Loretta, but an S Loretta, just looking for that as a source. And then you already have to know whether it's just because you define the source doesn't mean you're suppressing the right kind of content. You've got to know whether it's a theta or an alpha or a beta, and target the appropriate frequencies for training. But it's also the case that in anxiety, there's a certain percentage of them that have unexpected epileptiform discharges. In the literature, it varies. There's not a whole bunch of studies, but the few that are there, one shows a 12% incidence. And you say, oh, well, 12%, that's not so much, is it? Well, the background population is the 3%. So 12 is a 400% increase above baseline. So that's not great. But if you have panic on top of the anxiety, the odds go up to about a third. So, if you don't look at the EEG, you don't know whether they've got epileptiform discharges, and you might treat them with a pharmacological agent that may potentiate more if you don't know that they're there. If you know they're there, you can choose how to treat them. And there's a number of ways, obviously.
Nothing like treating the wrong condition.
Yeah.
But if you don't mind, I'd love to, as always, we go around the world within 3 minutes. So I want to pick a couple of pinpoints. But I also think we have to be a little bit cautious of the term anxiety. I want to play a little bit of a semantic game here. I really like using the term arousal. There's positive arousal, negative arousal, all these various stages of arousal. And I think the key is, when does arousal turn negative? And then we term it as anxiety. One of the things I really, really stress working primarily with children and adolescents is kind of flipping and reframing, saying, hey, you know what? You need a little bit of anxiety. You need what I call functional anxiety, because it tells you care, all right? Writing that exam, if you're just, who cares? You're not going to write a good exam. If you're going to be in a little dance performance or a play and you don't have a couple of little butterflies, again, you're going to go out there, who cares, not learn your routine, etc. So I think it's really, really important to frame this in terms of the human self-messaging system, and when to listen to it versus when it's too loud and it's screaming, creating that dysfunction. And then, of course, I think that's your link into addiction. When the scream of the anxiety, the nervousness, etc., is so high, that's where we all become attracted to self-medicating behaviors. But I think in our modern I'd say pathologizing culture, we press, pun intended, the panic button a little bit too quickly. And some of the work that we do is, we hook people up, show them where this emotion is coming from in the brain, and see, is it working for you? Is it not working for you? And what do we need to tone down versus not tone down? Now, looping back to Jay, if this is actually a micro seizure that we're calling panic, and it's actually, something entirely different, then that's a different story. But there's a whole range in our reality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and the behavior does not necessarily predict what you're going to find. Quite often it will tell you what network is not working right, but it doesn't tell you how that network is not working right. So you might be guided to the right spot by the behavior, but you have to look at the EEG to see what's wrong there. And that will then allow you to know how to fix it. So, and luckily, brains are so plastic, which has gotten a whole terrible spin because of plastics, but plasticity is malleability, changeability, and your brain is extremely changeable. You have the right to change your mind, and actually there was a manufacturer that had that as a a sticker, but they went out of business shortly thereafter. When the company says you have the right to change your mind, you go, oh, well, maybe that won't be the one I get then. But
you make a gender joke here now in terms of the intelligence of females, knowing that the right to change one's mind is actually a positive thing.
Yeah.
So one other thing, given that we have you, Master J, I have a running joke, which is the cingulate, I call that the stubborn region of the brain, is the hardest, it's the most stubborn to train. Any tips for our viewers in terms of best ways to access that region? I can share in terms of, what I do. I tend to, look at the occipit for quieting, the frontal lobes, and the last place I go to is the cingulate, not because it isn't the most important place, but because I can get much more traction working in the underplanes, and I guess massaging, making the cingulate ready for change. Do you have any training insights that you'd care to share?
Well, one of the things you have to realize is that the cingulate sounds like one thing, but it's actually the cognitive division, the rostral, and the subgenual affective divisions. So you have to know what you're shooting at before you go placing your electrodes. And FZ is a perfectly appropriate spot to get at for the cognitive division. Rumination, stuck thoughts, compulsive thoughts, those kind of things are up there. But if it's an affective division, you're going to have to get off your FZ and move your little electrode butt forward to AFZ or FPZ. Now, nobody uses nasopharyngeal electrodes anymore for a reason. I don't know if anybody here has ever done one of those. I'm old enough in EEG to know when we used to have to do them on a fairly routine basis when the doctor ordered them. Imagine a coat hanger piece about that long with a bend in the middle, and on a silver ball on the end of it. This is all insulated, but the silver ball is not. It's a centimeter.
We thought the COVID swipe was bad, huh?
Yeah, exactly. This is a centimeter-sized silver ball. So if you want to simulate it, take the tip of your little finger and shove it all the way up your nose. I mean, this is painful. Quite often led to bleeding noses, but they went up, and if you know what you're doing, you can angle them up and measure the orbital surface of the frontal lobe or the midline of the frontal lobe. If you didn't know what you're doing, you could crisscross them, and the one up the right nostril could be on the left side, But that it was largely given up. You can get equivalent information without having to tear somebody's nasal septum, So, but the where on that anterior cingulate are you targeting, and why? If you look with the EEG, there's some subtle features that end up predicting how far forward you're going to have to get. When you look at the alpha peaks up front, and you find the hypercoherence, you're going to end up having to work frontally. And if you find FP1, FP2 alpha are bigger than F3, F4 alpha in any kind of a significant way, you've got a rostral or subgenual source up there. It isn't like alpha from the back is getting weaker and weaker and weaker as you go forward. That has gotten larger when you went further forward. You've got an anterior cingulate source. And at that point, it's not cognitive. That would be FZ. If FZ is big and FP1, FP2 aren't as big, you've got a cognitive division. But if you have FP1, FP2 large, you're going to be shooting at the rostral or subgenual location. And again, some people put an entire cap on, have a Loretta predefined location, and they can feed back the activity there with S Loretta. That has been shown to actually work. There's efficacy literature support for that technique. not for any, just for that technique, not for any particular application of that technique, but they have shown that you can actually train a brain area with Loretta. Now, there's a few applications that are starting to get some efficacy specific with that. Some of the work from DeRitter's lab on the anterior cingulate and posterior cingulate, and the default and salience network and all that. Some of that is going to be probably in the next round of the white papers that form the basis of our field's efficacy literature. It takes a while. It's got to, all these things have to be published and hopefully replicated, and at that point they end up with a shift in what has efficacy support. But I have to say, we worked with addiction. We had an N of 30, and the 30 that we did, here we are. This was the publication in biofeedback, but I've got a PowerPoint which has got a little better graphics. You don't need to focus on the statistics of addiction. I mean, for goodness sakes, everybody knows it costs us a damn fortune, and if you spend money on treatment, it saves you money on problems. But that, you know, we actually do have efficacy literature. Our field, back when I was president of ISNR and Don Moss was president of AAPB, and we got a group together, this group, and they came up with a template that could end up guiding you as to how efficacious the application you're talking about actually was. What kind of study you need to have to make what kind of claim. And using that, we actually have probably efficacious as the level of support for both the Peniston and the Scott protocols. Those are essentially alpha theta style protocols. So
started it all.
and again, Peniston Kukulski did some sympathetic training with electrodermal or temperature, and then did the alpha theta. Scott does some HRV, but they also have some pre-treatment either with SMR or beta or suppression to get rid of an alpha or a theta problem before the alpha theta is trained. So the Peniston is kind of old school. If you have an alpha excess, they didn't do QEGs ahead of time to guide them. Scott's seen obviously all of that. What we found is essentially in our N of 30, we had 21 of them that had over-arousal as their drive mechanism for their addiction. And about a third of them had an OCD drive for their addiction. Now, over-arousal was either a low-voltage fast EEG, which gets SMR training and then alpha theta, and this is straight out of the 2005 phenotype model publication. If you have fast alpha phenotype, you get alpha theta directly. You don't just go straight to alpha theta, don't pass go, don't collect $200, just go straight to that training. Beta spindling, and this is the N of them, SMR training, and then alpha theta. So if you have over-arousal, alpha theta is part of your training. It's a core part of your training to drop your arousal level and gain control. And once you train it, the drive of over-arousal is gone, and the behavior associated with it, the addiction, is gone. Cingulate either had, these were at FZ, these are all at the back of the head. We had either alpha or slow or beta. This is a low voltage fast EEG, 8 to 12 hertz, Z-score, blue heads, basically a deficit compared to normal. Now, time 1, 2 shots of alcohol. You can see they're getting a little bit of alpha. Time 2, total of 4 shots of alcohol. Now they got some pretty good alpha going. Time 3, now this is 6 shots of alcohol. Most people with 6 shots of alcohol are, well, I haven't drank in over 30 years, but geez Louise, even back when I could, 6 shots of alcohol is a fairly stiff start. Yeah. Now, Pete's a big guy, and he might take a few more than the normal person, but for goodness sakes, most people start here with alpha, and 2 shots would get them loose, and like 6 shot has this low voltage fast person. You can see why the low voltage fast EEG, which has a gene number 4 marker genetically, which you produce more GABA A receptor sites than you can saturate, so you're over aroused. And you need some GABA. Well, alcohol gives you GABA, but you can get GABA from lots of things now. Benzodiazepines, various opioid kind of things will kind of work as well, but it's a slippery slope towards addiction if you have that pattern. Mm-hmm. The Cingulate, this is the anterior cingulate slow group. This is up in the faster frequencies. This is a low voltage fast. You can see Z-scores are all basically negative. They're starting to get almost normal up into the higher frequencies, but this is a low voltage fast EEG, which is again an over-arousal pattern. If you could reach into the thalamus and control the polarization, you could control the frequency of the alpha. And if you hyperpolarize it, you slow it way down. If you hypopolarize it, you can speed it up. If you speed it up and up and up, you get like 12 hertz, real fast alpha. People are very sharp and bright. Speed it up a little bit more and a little bit more. 15, 16 hertz, it starts to desynchronize. It can't line up the peaks anymore. So then it's desynchronized. It's a low voltage fast EEG. It's so over aroused, it doesn't have a rhythm. Now, the first description of that was Adrian and Matthews in England, early 1930s. They were looking for the Berger rhythm right after Berger's publication on EEG. And Adrian had alpha. Matthews had an EEG with no apparent rhythmicity. And you realize what kind of quality amps they had. A low voltage fast EEG, they wouldn't have seen a damn thing. So, and because they were lab partners, it became called a normal variant. Low voltage fast EEGs are not really a normal variant. They're a deviant pattern that indicates gross over arousal. You can treat it. It doesn't have to be pathology. You don't have to be a drunk. You could be a dry drunk, a teetotaler who never touched anything. This is fast alpha, 12, 13 hertz fast alpha. And again, this person basically gets the 8 to 12 hertz alpha training, and you fill in the slower alpha frequencies, and you're going to suppress some of these faster frequencies. So you're going to shape it down into a normal rhythmicity. And alpha theta training, you have to get the alpha first. If you're missing alpha frequencies and you start to do the theta, Anna Weiss used to call that a gooseneck, where there was a missing frequency band, and she would suggest energy couldn't really flow along the frequency spectrum. It would be a block. So you've got to get the alpha working all the way through the alpha band before you start to do theta crossovers. Beta spindles, here the size of the beta is gigantic. And so what did we find? Well, just like the Royal College of Medicine, alpha theta training decreased the over-arousal. John Griselier found that alpha theta training for people that had some alpha in the first place, not a low voltage fast person, because that will end up creating alpha. But if you had it in the first place, these were students that had it, it decreased beta. It decreased the over-arousal. And then Marco Congito showed that anterior cingulate related training could get you contingent behavioral improvement in OCD. So that's basically our work was similar to that. But 1-year follow-up, all 30 people are still clean and sober. And that's not normal. That's kind of
That's nice.
Yeah, my goodness. It's hard to get people to even believe the results because it's so, recidivism is the nature of addictive treatment. And getting a 30% success rate is considered pretty damn good. So 100 clean and sober at the end of 1 year that's kind of an extraordinary claim. But we trained, Pennison got 70%, but he did alpha theta. He didn't address the anterior cingulate group, so he would get about 70% who had missed the anterior cingulate group. So this is a pre-post Woodcock Johnson. 3 can be given at 1-year follow-up. So we got a 21-point jump in IQ. Standard scores, pre-score on thinking ability, 103 to 122. Cognitive efficiency, standard score, 94 to 118. These, when you make the brain work better, it works better. And a 21-point IQ jump is not supposed to happen. Look at the IQ manual stuff. They say, well, a small percentage change, a little variability, but 21-point jump, come on. That's unheard of. Audiovisual learning ability. This isn't a great score to start with, but it turned out pretty well. Now, this is delayed recall. That score for a delayed recall is awful. If you hide a $10 bill under your keyboard on the computer and tell them at the end of the session, if you can tell me where the $10 is, you get to keep it. You could probably keep that $10 during the end of that session. Their ability to remember anything for 30 minutes is pretty slim. It came up to normal, but it started out really bad. And here the mean is 65. Over here, 65 is about here. So
well, Jay, you're talking about, brain effects, but also life effects. I think one of the other things that, I'm going to play with elephants with alcoholism, but, the elephant in the room is if you remove a consistent sedative, your intelligence is going to shoot up as well. So I think you're getting this from both sides. So to me, these results are beautiful and of course should be celebrated, but they shouldn't be so surprising given what you were doing. It's something that works.
Yeah. We added neurofeedback based on their phenotype to a kind of a standard stepper program. It wasn't a bad stepper program. It was a fairly expensive one, but still the model wasn't anything different than what you'd find in most 12-step programs.
Well, I don't know. Also, Jay, the other thing you have to consider is you're not just removing the alcohol, you're quieting, right?
Yes.
So it makes a huge difference, talking about reasons for sliding back and recidivism.
In this program, it wasn't all alcoholism either.
Oh, all right.
So there were a variety of,
I think the point
that said, somebody who's got a low voltage fast that gets into alcohol will potentially at some point want to have a little cocaine so they can have a little more alcohol. So, the mix.
That's the party model, isn't it?
the mix of once you're into an addictive lifestyle, what you have access to largely ends up determining stuff. And but some addictions are much more damaging than others. Cocaine, crack, cocaine, and then obviously the death rate with opioids and fentanyl and all of that. So it's addiction is hazardous to life and limb, and it's damaging to life and quality of life and relationships in life. And teenagers right now have a lot of stress. Now, stress is not bad. Strain is bad. Stress is the fire that was lit under your butt that got you up to go do something. Strain is sitting there so long that your butt gets burned. So you really do need stressors in life, but you need to handle them properly. Chronic stress ends up being damaging. That's problematic.
Well, we're looking right back into the anxiety, the discussion on anxiety.
Yeah.
It's semantics about frequency and consistency and levels. Yeah.
If your arousal is kicked up because of anxiety and the stress is chronic, your brain responds to the stress by making cortisol. And if it makes cortisol consistently all the time, it actually shrinks your hippocampus. So your memory processor isn't going to be really that functional. And to a certain extent, some of the very poor memory performance within the study may have been predicted by, drugs and alcohol negatively impacting brain function, and that hippocampus not working so well.
So how do you reinflate the hippocampus, Jay?
Well, we basically hope to not end up damaging it, but a long time ago, I would have thought that the white matter was just wiring, and it was fixed. Once you got it, that was what you got. And Mario Beauregard at Montreal Neurological published a couple of papers showing that neurofeedback changed white matter and gray matter. And that should have been enough for me, but I'm a little slow, and it took me one more kick in the head to get it. And that was Dr. Pineda's work at San Diego on autism, where they used diffusion tensor imaging, and the neurofeedback seemed to sculpt the white matter that was observed in the DTI studies. So, yeah, gray matter and white matter. Now, you've got hippocampus that, if it's severely damaged, it usually isn't seen to have a major recovery, but that's structure, not function. And as an example, in Parkinsonism, the damage to the substantia nigra has to be about 70% gone before you show your tremor. So, the fact that you've lost 20% of your hippocampus may not be a fatal blow to hippocampal function.
Don't tell the kids that.
You probably still have some capacity there, as long as you don't continue to whittle away at it. The kids' Theta Beta ratio in 1999 was able to predict the occurrence of ADD, ADHD from normal, 95 to 98% accurate. The amount of sleep they get now is 2 hours less per night. And the Theta Beta ratio effect size went from 1.8, which is how you get that high of percent accuracy, differentiating two groups from each other. Effect size is the way you measure that. It went down to 0.2 to 0.4. Those groups are overlapping so bad you can't tell one from the other anymore based on the Theta Beta ratio. The ratios up around 12 to 1 start to become a little more likely to be in the ADD group, but it used to be outside normal at 5 to 1. Yeah. That was 3 standard deviations out back in 1999. So it's the lack of sleep is considerably damaging to brain function. And during sleep you consolidate memory. During sleep, you produce growth hormone, which allows you to recover from the wear and tear and allows you to grow new brain connections that you can play REM back through to consolidate memories with. Sleep is a critical piece of function. And if you disturb your sleep too badly.
Bringing that up, Jay. I think you know that we keep a really, really strong clinical database. We've been doing so now for over 20 years, and tracking that it's phenomenal what we're seeing. And I think it's the generalized hyperarousal and sleep deprivation in the whole population. We have to start taking this seriously.
Yeah, and there are some kids now, when we do testing on them, they're actually achieving vertex sharp waves indicating stage 2 sleep with their eyes open, and that's a sleep disorder. That's essentially narcolepsy with no cataplexy. You can't stay awake. Eyes open.
When we put caps on kids now, like they're just gone to the point there. We just stop the assessment. There's no point in doing it. You're just getting a person snoozing.
And if you do neurofeedback with a person who's got a sleep disorder and they're not sleeping, they're not consolidating the memory of what they learned from the sessions. So you could pay twice as much or 3 times as much for your neurofeedback because it took you that much longer to get it. The efficiency per session has gone way down because of the lack of sleep. So sleep is an important part of it. And I urge people that are doing a practice to get a hold of a free sleep assessment, the Pittsburgh Sleep Inventory. And it's a self-report that's very brief, it's standardized, and it catches outlier odd sleep issues that it isn't necessarily your first line of questioning when somebody walks in the door. But if they filled out this short report, it'll flag you.
Jay and Marie, you both brought up that you should have a certain amount of stress. You don't want too much. Like, what is the line that you're crossing, and what do you see on the EEG? Like, what's something objective that you can look at besides sitting in a chair too long and my butt being on fire or whatever you said?
This is where the classic answer, it depends.
Depends on what?
That depends, though. That's what you have to wear because your butt's on fire.
No, Jay, but a good one.
What I would suggest is that we go back to the 1950s. Malmo and Chagasse, they developed the knowledge of the arousal performance continuum. If you're under-aroused, you don't perform very well. Imagine waking up in the morning, groggy, sluggish, under-aroused. Where the hell is my coffee? Well, you need a little bit of an increase in arousal to start to actually function at all. But once you've got enough arousal, further arousal, like drinking a 3rd cup of Pete's coffee, like I might make it, the spoon stands up and slowly dissolves, but if you do that, you get such a high arousal level that you become harried and scattered and incapable of decision making because you're just being flooded with over aroused. How do you measure that arousal? Well, Malmo and Chagasse had a flicker fusion rate, but you can look at your alpha frequencies. If your alpha frequencies are real slow, you need more stress or stimulation. And if it's too fast, you're over aroused and too scattered and too harried. And it could be Goldilocks, 10 hertz, 9.5, 10 hertz, the Goldilocks frequency. But you could be too fast or too slow, and your arousal level determines that. Now, ideally, you have a broad range of alpha, a much slower and much faster. That range of alpha allows for resiliency. If your alpha is just at 10, and the doctor will say, 10 hertz, that's normal. Yeah, but if there's no variance, it's like having heart rate, no variability. It's a prediction of failure. It's too rigid a system. if it's under stress in one way or another, it will shatter. It won't flex. There's no resilience to it. So you want the little slop in your alpha frequency band. It's good to have a little faster and slower. If you're stuck on 10 or 12, you're going to have difficulties winding down, and your over-arousal will keep you from winding down in the evening, for instance. So anyway,
we're rotating around the same three things. Obviously we want to loop in sleep here. We also want to, loop in rhythms and patterns. I've kind of nicknamed in a couple of my presentations, Alpha, the brain barometer. It kind of measures the weather of the brain, but you need all kinds of different weather systems depending on what you're doing and what you're not doing. And I think a really in tune Alpha is, it's what it's all about. But the other thing I also want to kind of loop in is, we see this frequently with artistic process. There's the notion of flow as well. And I think in academia, we get far too attached to this rigidity. Like you get up, you have your one cup of coffee, you need a little bit more to boost you up. But I think we need to also respect the natural variance. And sometimes arousal associated with production flow, it isn't constant. And I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing. I think also training a person to recognize that can be extremely important. And also knowing when not to push it. Working with children, I mean, bless the parents. They really, really want their kids to succeed, but they push too much too far. And the children do get in these beautiful states of, I would say, a certain amount of hyper arousal. They produce very well, but they crash really hard as well. And we're looping right back into that anxiety, right? So yeah, we're coming full circle. I think the three topics are really integrating here.
Yeah. In the EEG, eyes open, when we have anxiety and PTSD, we end up seeing lambda waves. And the lambda waves end up indicating that the amygdala is overactivated with emotion. And it changes the thalamic gating, and the arrival of every visual input at the back of your head ends up being a gigantic lambda wave. So, and you're visual hypervigilance, so you see lambda, 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 which is a normal rhythm of, it's a normal event associated with visual scanning. But when you're told to sit there and stare at the wall and you get lambda, 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 what are you visually dissecting on the wall? It's just visual hypervigilance. And then when you close the eyes, you turn on the default mode system, and the right temporal parietal junction, T6 or old T6, new P8, as an electrode site, gets a gigantic alpha peak. And that basically, there's an idling of the social perceptual area. And it's perhaps self-protective, but you've turned off or turned down your sensitivity to affective input and facial expressions, body language, the tone of speech, all of that's attenuated.
Well, looping back into my work, that's what I see also with individuals who really, really use screens excessively.
Anyway, we've got ability to end up training those sites and changing those patterns. The human brain is plastic enough so it can change itself. It needs a little guidance. I quite often hear, and it frustrates me when I hear it. Oh, we just give the brain all the information and it figures out what to do with it.
Don't get me going. Don't get me going.
If it was so good at figuring it out and making it good, why is it so messed up now? So, the brain can be improved. It can be optimized, but it doesn't necessarily have the knowledge inside of itself as to how to get that done. And that's why there's some people out there like Mari that are professionals that can end up helping on these things. Goodness knows, don't come to me.
Hey.
Well, I'm retired, and I'm not a therapist. I'm an old AG tech, So,
Dr. Murray, let's close.
Self-deprecating one. Sorry.
Mom and dad watching, listening. How do they know their kid is too stressed?
Observe them. Yeah. But I mean, gosh, bless us all. We tend to be very, very self-projecting. I would dare say even ignorant about some of the emotional states of the people closest to us. And again, I'm not thinking, narcissistically or in a negative way, but very frequently our desires for, children to succeed, adolescents, or even adult children and partners to succeed overrides our ability to see the downside, the catch-22, the potential suffering, the stress, the anxiety, right? So I'd say with anything that it's a continuum. It's a continuum. I mean, the opposite that we're really seeing now is many, poor darling, sit on your bed with your feet up and watch your screen. Life is too stressful. I mean, that's the opposite. We're seeing it all. But I would just say, talk with your kids. Observe them, really see what makes them tick, push them enough so that they have all the tools that they need for the choices they want to make and be self-sufficient, happy, independent, successful people. Yeah, get in there, be there.
If you're a techie kind of a parent, you might consider getting them an Oura Ring or a Fitbit or an Apple Watch that will end up monitoring their physiology so that they can become tuned into that. They can watch their own heart rate variability. They can look at their sleep scores, and it does make some suggestions.
I'm going to disagree with the great Jay. Yeah, I think people get obsessed with that and they lose their ability to feel within self. I think it can be extremely important to ensure that you learn and without some kind of external device telling you how you're feeling based on your physiology. Now, as a starting point to understand, I'm completely with you, but I think at some point it's imperative to drop this. Like, you shouldn't need a device to tell you that you're sleepy and it's time to go to bed. You shouldn't.
That's why
tell you you're
feedback is provided to sensitize you to the internal state, so you no longer depend on the device. Okay. But occasionally the device is needed to focus you on the internal sensation so that you can control it well enough. So you don't need the device. But I do suggest that adolescents who have sleep difficulties, the Oura Ring allows them to document exactly what kind of sleep problem it is. If it's an apnea, it has to be treated. Yeah. And it'll catch the hypoxia. So anyway, techie parents, the possibility of monitoring technology, again, to sensitize the kid to the internal state stuff. And they don't necessarily end up having to wear it the rest of their life. But
kids don't want feedback from their parents, so that'll work. It's a third party. We all agree to disagree. Don't get addicted to your addictions.
Actually, no, I think with rephrasing, Jay and I are on the same page. It's just a matter of don't let tech do the job all the time, but to have tech bring you in to understand yourself better and be one with yourself better, by all means. That's the good part of tech. Yeah.
I'm going to have to ask ChatGPT what you just said. Jay Gunkelman, the man who's read over 500,000 brain scans. Dr. Mari Swingle, author of iMinds. Thank you for another outstanding episode of the NeuroNoodle Neurofeedback Podcast.
Thank you. Bye.
The NeuroNoodle Podcast is supported by listeners and businesses just like you.